Hello, we're rolling into another episode of the DRH show. As usual, in each episode, I'll be talking to interesting people within psychology, mental health, and well-being. Today, I'll be talking to one of the most popular clinical psychologists. He is the author of the international bestseller called In Sheep's Clothing. Dr. George Simon, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Dennis. I'm happy to be with you.
Thank you. Dr. Simon, I'd like to start off with your background. So if you could just tell us your trajectory in life, especially what attracted you to the study of psychological manipulation.
Oh, wow. Early in my career, I studied a very eclectic psychology program. And early in my career, I began to realize that many of the things that I had been taught about how to help people with problems were probably not appropriate for our times, should I say. Um, we didn't have a lot of folks struggling with the same issues that uh, folks like Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung and all of those grandfathers of some schools of psychology dealt with. So we had a whole different set of problems, and the ways that we were trying to approach dealing with them were not working. And I'm the way I'm kind of wired personality. I don't like to waste time or energy, and I certainly don't like taking people's money and not helping to produce results.
Mm.
So very early on in my career, I decided to really do some research, not just empirical research, but clinical case study research of my own to figure out what was wrong with the approach that I was taking. And then my clients gave me a real education. What we now call the gaslighting effect didn't have a name, but I knew that there was something that made people in relationships with covertly aggressive people, manipulative people. I knew that there was something about their relationships that made them feel crazy. And this was a common report from so many people. I decided to look into that, and that's really what made In Sheep's Clothing, my first book, first published back in 1995. That's what made it a runaway bestseller, because right from the beginning, it told people basically, I know you're having this crazy feeling, but you're not crazy. This is what's really going on. It resonated very well. So
Mhm.
that really basically changed my life, changed my professional career, changed my perspective, and opened up a lot of doorways to future work.
So since then, you've been exploring psychological manipulation. Well, you've already mentioned some of the components of psychological manipulation. You've mentioned about gaslighting. But I suppose for the benefit of the listeners and the readers, could you just um, give us a comprehensive overview of what exactly is psychological manipulation?
Yeah. At the heart of most psychological manipulation is what I call in my books covert aggression. It's aggression undercover. A person wants to have their way with you. They want to get the better of you. They want to exploit you, take advantage of you, maybe even abuse you. But they are so clever and stealthful about how they do it. And they're so good at convincing you that they're doing anything but, that you end up feeling crazy. This is the gaslighting effect. You know that they're up to no good in your gut, but you can't prove it. And this is what makes you feel crazy. They give those plausible sounding rationalizations. They play the victim themselves. They blame you. And they do it in such a way that makes them look good and makes you look like the fool. And that's the whole heart of it. Now, that's most of psychological manipulation. There are other more overt forms of manipulation too, um, but that's the majority of it. Right
Mhm.
there.
And well, when we talk about manipulation, you explain that some people want to make themselves look good, or at some instances, they want to other people to perceive them as they are the victim. Now, the way you characterize it, I was thinking that aren't we all manipulative to some degree?
To some degree, yes. You
Mm-hmm.
know, early on, we learn these tactics that I describe in all four of my books. We learn, and this is not particularly uncommon, and it's not necessarily horribly bad. The problem is that some folks manipulate for a lifestyle. Some folks are really good at what we call the art of impression management. They're good at looking good without being good. They
Mm-hmm.
have serious moral character defects,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't care to tend to those defects, nor do they ever change them. They just want you to believe that they're a different kind of person. And so when somebody adopts that kind of basic way of dealing with people in relationships, that's a problem. We all manipulate to some degree, and we kind of know we're doing it. And many times we even justify it in our minds, but we don't do it for a lifestyle, and we don't do it to routinely, ruthlessly take advantage of people. That's the difference.
Mhm. And Dr. Simon, I just want to touch upon on what you said about the difference with someone being a manipulator and someone just just being themselves. You mentioned something about character defect. Could you just expand on what are the other telltale signs that someone is a manipulator aside from the fact that they've got character defect?
Yeah. Well, the signs have to do with the tactics.
Mm-hmm.
The person you're dealing with in a relationship that you're trying to understand, you're trying to cultivate a healthy rapport with, if that person always has an excuse for behavior that's hurtful, if they constantly blame you and accept no responsibility, if they constantly sidestep issues, uh, try to control your feelings and your behavior through guilt and shame, all of the tactics that I describe in the books, it's the tactics that reveal the person for who they are.
Mm-hmm.
It's these behavioral strategies that they have overlearned to have their way in life and to get the things they want in life. And that's why I spend so much time in all my books outlining those tactics and heightening people's awareness about
Mm-hmm. It's interesting you mentioned something about the tactic because for those people who have been in a relationship with someone who's got a manipulative personality, and they would talk to other people who've got experience with the same person. It seems that manipulators, in essence, they would be reading from the same manual, and they seem to employ the same tactics. So why would that be the case?
Wow. That's a really interesting subject. You know, the short answer to that is people engage in behavioral strategies that appear to pay off,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and cease uh, engaging in those strategies when it no longer pays off. So what really has to happen in any manipulative relationship is rather than attempting to understand or even attempting to change the other person, the person who's on the receiving end of tactics has to become so astute and so unswayed by the tactics that they become more empowered and know basically how to handle themselves in such situations.
Hmm. And based from your experience, Dr. Simon, because you have decades of experience and you've obviously worked on this topic, you have a book about this subject. Based from your experience, who is more manipulative, men or women?
I, uh, I kind of anticipated that question, not just
Mhm.
from your preparatory material, but I get asked that question at workshops all the time.
Mm.
And I can tell you that these days, character disturbance is two things. It's a spectrum phenomenon, which means that much like we've learned about many, many conditions, including autism, various developmental conditions, uh, much like that, character disturbances exist along a spectrum of
Mm.
degree and type. So it varies. But as far as men and women goes, uh, it's kind of an equal opportunity thing. We do live in an age where character disturbance of some degree and some type is much more prevalent than the kinds of problems that psychologists and social workers and other mental health professionals used to concern themselves with. So now men and women may do it slightly differently. They may prefer different ways of manipulating, but it's kind of an equal opportunity thing. Now, I must say that more women find themselves uh, lured into and trapped in abusive relationship
Mm.
by men who are skilled at these tactics.
Mm.
Who
Why
are
do you think that's the case?
well, because, well, two things. The charm alarm does not go off at the beginning of the relationship.
Mm.
Some people just flat out know how to charm.
Mm.
They are good at reading people's wants and needs. And so if you want to charm somebody, if you want to charm the socks off of them, you tell them what they want to hear, and you give them what they want to receive. Now, the person on the receiving end of that doesn't automatically say to themselves, what does this person want of me? And by the way, are they of the character that I should give them what they want? The person doesn't automatically say that. They're blown away by the charm. They're blown away by the seduction. And only later in the relationship, as the abuse, the very subtle abuse that existed right from the very beginning becomes more overt, do they realize what a mess they've gotten into. And by then, there's a lot at stake. So it's a bit late to think of just uh, exiting. Many times there's finances involved, children involved, all kinds of other things. So it's not so easy to just walk away.
Mhm. And we talk about how, men and women manipulate differently, or how they're impacted by people who manipulate within a relationship. But what about children? Based from your experience, are there also manipulative children?
Oh, children they learn very early,
Hmm.
because it's the most natural human thing.
Hmm.
It's the most natural human thing. This was the great revelation. All of our traditional psychologies are 100% fear-based. They concern themselves almost exclusively about what people are afraid of and what they run from and how they run. But we are human beings, and only a part of us is wired to respond to fear. There's another part of us, there's another part of all of us that wants things and is willing to fight for things.
Hmm.
We don't just flee, we fight too. That's fundamental. Now, how we do that in a social sphere makes all the difference in our character. We are not just runners, we are fighters. We are created that way. And acceptance of that and acceptance of the obligation to do that in a conscientious, or what we call assertive way, as opposed to a clandestine or manipulative way, makes all the difference in our character. So children learn early on they're natural born fighters. They're not just runners. They want things. They see a toy that their brother or sister is playing with and they want that toy. They go after it. And when they don't get it or there's interference, they'll use all kinds of tactics to try and get it. This is natural and it's human. And because our early psychology refused to look at that dimension of human behavior, we ended up not helping people in this age of character disturbance. So that was the big insight. That was the single biggest insight of my professional life, was to look at the psychology of fighting for the first time, how people do it, why they do it, the clever, ingenious ways that they can come up with to do it, and develop a psychology for that. That was a real challenge. We didn't have one. And we were told this. We were also told this, and it's so patently false. We were told that people only did aggress or show any kind of fighting behavior when they felt threatened. That's totally untrue. People will fight for the things that they desire. And they will fight in very subtle and clever ways to get the things they desire. And it's not necessarily rooted in fear of anything. They're not necessarily defending themselves. They're just trying to get something. You know, I'll give an example, the notorious financial swindler, Bernie Madoff. He just wanted to get rich. He didn't care how many little old ladies he bilked out of their pensions. And it wasn't that he was afraid of not being able to make it. He was already quite wealthy, but he was greedy. He wanted more. He wanted to be the richest, and he wanted to do it at the expense of everybody, including dear sweet little pensioners.
Now, Dr. Simon, what I'd like to pick up on that point that you've raised, that essentially we're not just runners, but we're also fighters. I'm just wondering, why is it that people who have experienced a traumatic relationship still seem to cling to this kind of relationship instead of, fighting against that relationship?
Yeah. Well, there's two big reasons for that. One is a very justifiable fear. Once folks realize what kind of relationship they're in, what the character of their abuser is really all about, once they realize that, they also realize that this person who is out to dominate and to control, once they realize that that person will stop at nothing to maintain the position of dominance, they know in the deepest recesses of their gut, they know that the most dangerous time for them is when they put up a fight, or when they threaten to separate, or when they plan an exit, because they know that the one thing that the abuser or the person hell-bent on domination will never accept is no for an answer. So, in my book, In Sheep's Clothing, and in my book, Character Disturbance, I outline the only four possible outcomes the aggressive personalities among us see. I win, you lose. So that's the way they like it. They also see the possibility you win, I lose, and they will never accept that. They will sometime accept a win-win, I win, you win, if it seems like that's the only reasonable alternative. But what happens in too many abusive relationships that end in murder-suicide is when the abuser knows that the jig is finally up, and it occurs to them that I might lose. The only possible other outcome for them is you lose too. In other words, if I'm going down, you're going down.
Mhm.
If I have to suffer the humiliation of defeat, I'm taking you with me.
Mhm.
Uh, I'm not going to let you win because it's just too unacceptable to me. And that's a sad, sad, tragic scenario. But unfortunately, as anybody who's been in an abusive relationship or has worked with abuse victims knows, that is not an unlikely outcome. It happens way too frequently.
Mhm. I would also like to pick some of the things you mentioned, that the common tactics that people who manipulate, what kind of tactics they use. You mentioned earlier about gaslighting. One of the buzzwords that I also hear is stonewalling. Is that also a form of psychological manipulation?
Okay, I'm so sorry. I didn't catch the word you were.
Stonewalling, but
Yeah,
basically it's when you don't talk to people for a longer period of time.
yeah. You can't list all the possible tactics.
Hmm.
You can't list them
Hmm.
uh, because almost anything in a person who is determined. I say at my workshops with professionals because
Hmm.
this is something that so many helping professionals just don't get. Um, I use the analogy with real estate. There's an old saying in real estate that there are three things that matter: location, location, and location.
Hmm.
And when I talk about these particularly disturbed characters, I say in relationships, there's only three things that matter: position, position, and position. And
Hmm.
when a person is determined, absolutely determined, to always have the position of advantage, to always have the position of dominance, to always being in the controlling or the governing position, any tactic is possible. They'll
Hmm.
find a way. They'll find a clever little way to maintain position.
Hmm.
And of course, that's the very definition of an abusive relationship.
Hmm.
Because healthy relations, healthy intimate relationships are mutually respectful. It's not a constant struggle for dominance of one
Hmm.
person over the other.
And of course, this is not just some romantic relationship, but it applies on any other kind of relationship, whether
Any relationship.
employment or let's say from a student to a lecturer. I think what we have to understand is really, I like what you said, that there's really, you're trying to maintain your position of power and you're trying to be dominant with us, with the relationship. And really what you're trying to say that a relationship is supposed to be, it's a two-way street. It's not a struggle more than anything else. Now, what I'd like to hear from you, Dr. Simon, is based from your experience. What kind of advice you would like to give for those people who are in this kind of relationship?
You know, I wish the answer were simple.
Mm-hmm.
On my blog at drgeorgesimon.com, I get a lot of comments from people when I talk about people who are on the milder end of the character disturbance spectrum, and about how sometimes in midlife, those people, as a result of learning experience, come to realize that what they thought was working for them early on isn't working so well anymore. So they actually reach out for help.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I always get a lot of flack when I talk about this from readers who cannot see and who have been in relationships with more severely disturbed characters. They cannot see the spectrum for as broad as it is, and they want to paint with a broad brush and categorize every disturbed character as either a sociopath or a psychopath or a dyed-in-the-wool manipulator hell-bent on dominance. Um, and I wish that it were that simple. It's not that simple.
Mm-hmm.
So the first step to answer your question is to get a reasonable read on how serious a character disturbance we're talking about. Character disturbance is a spectrum phenomenon of both type and degree. So it's not just whether the person is character impaired. It's how are they impaired and to what degree? Do they have absolutely no conscience? If the answer to that is if they have no capacity for empathy and no conscience, get out,
Mhm.
run. That's the only answer. But that's not always the case. So, what's really hard for people today, especially, is to find the right kind of help. Clinicians that really get it, that really understand that we're living in a different age and time, that there is this phenomenon called character disturbance, that it requires special expertise to properly assess and advise people about. And all too often, I will say, and this is why I have done workshops for the better part of 25 years, all too often, I will say that people have experienced what we call therapy-induced trauma. And that is they went for help, but maybe when they went for help, maybe the clinician was not a believer in character dysfunction. Maybe they thought everybody is just a wounded child trying to overcome fears and insecurities. Maybe they were the gullible type who was charmed by the abuser and bought everything that they said. Maybe that person turned on the waterworks as a tactic and it affected them. Um, and then they didn't see merit to the victim's claims of abuse. So there, a lot of things can go wrong when a person seeks help and the clinician is not astute enough about the nature of character disturbance.
Thank you, Dr. Simon. Now, I'd like to move on to your, obviously, you've been an expert with psychological manipulation, but what are your other areas of expertise?
Well, character development is a big area of expertise. And like I said, fortunately for all of us, not everybody who's got character impairments is on the severe end of the spectrum. I think you only have to think about your own life and your own growth and development. I'm sure all of us have things that we look back 10, 15, maybe longer years ago and say, what was I thinking? You know? So we mature, we grow, especially if we have enough of a conscience and enough conscientiousness to do that. So one of my work used to be almost 90% exclusively victims in abusive relationships. Now my work has become helping people who are not so severe on the character disturbance spectrum become better people. And in that light, I'm working on my 5th book right now, which is an expounding on the 10 commandments of character. I call them the 10 essential life principles that you have to master in order to turn out to be a kind of a decent human being. And these lessons, unfortunately, are not being learned all that well in our kind of crazy, mixed up society with respect to some of its values.
And so that's an interesting area that you work on. You work on character development as well. Now, I was exploring your website before this interview, and then I stumbled upon an interesting syndrome. It's called Judas syndrome. And to be honest, I've never come across with that. So could you just help us understand what exactly is Judas syndrome?
Yeah, it's my only book. The Judas Syndrome is my only book from a Christian faith perspective. And the reason I wrote it is that the teachings of the person that Christians profess to both worship and follow are difficult. But I can't find any fault with them. The problem is that really embracing them and really living as he asked us to live doesn't make any rational sense in this
Mhm.
crazy, flawed, imperfect, hostile, uh, cold sometimes world. So we kind of say, I think many times, this is lofty advice that he's giving us, but it's pretty impractical. And I betray my lack of real faith um, by the fact that I don't really do as he commanded to do.
Mhm.
And it was, by the way, from him a command. It was a mandate, um, not a suggestion. So we all reflect our own little Judas in that we may profess with our lips that we believe that um, he has the authority to tell us to live in a certain way, but we don't do it, and that betrays our lack of faith. Because if we did really believe him and in him, we would behave a lot differently.
Mhm.
I
And
see. Go ahead.
sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna ask you if because you've written a book in sheep's clothing. Could you just talk us through with your other books?
Okay, so In Sheep's Clothing was the result of my 15-year clinical research into victims in manipulative and abusive relationships and how they got hoodwinked, how they got manipulated,
Mhm.
uh, how they felt crazy, which we now call the gaslighting effect. And so it was written for that group of folks to help empower them to get on their feet again and to restore uh, uh, a, a healthy life. Character disturbance was my attempt to outline the phenomenon of our age. When Sigmund Freud saw patients, they were individuals who were so anxious, so pathologically anxious, and for such no good reason that they literally were making themselves sick. They were blind when they weren't even really blind. They had paralyses that were not genuine. They had a malady of other diseases that had their roots in too much anxieties. They were giving themselves ulcers and all kinds of other gastric distress. These were the people he saw because it was the Victorian era. And as I say at my workshops, if there were a motto or a slogan that would describe the zeitgeist or the cultural climate of that era, it would be, don't even think about it.
Mhm.
And people were, as we children of the 60s used to say, very hung up about everything, and unreasonably so, to the point that they were making themselves sick. Well, these days, the exact opposite is true. We have too many people who, quite frankly, are not hung up enough about the things that they let themselves do. And
Mhm.
it's not that they're making themselves miserable, they're making everybody else miserable.
Mhm.
So we have an entirely different phenomenon. And I wanted character disturbance to lay it out there so that both clinicians and lay people would say, you know what? This is a whole different time. We need a whole different perspective on human behavior. And we need a whole different approach in trying to help people become better people. That's why I wrote Character Disturbance.
Mhm.
How did we end up here? My latest book with co-author Kathy Armistead. Dr. Armistead and I wanted to help people who had been through uh, an unhealthy relationship of any kind discern, how did I get here? which is why we titled the book the way we did.
Mm-hmm.
And what's the best thing that I can do for myself to help ensure that I don't make the same mistakes again and that I don't end up duped again or in the same kind of situation again. So that's why we wrote How Did We End Up Here? The Judas syndrome was my testament
Mm-hmm.
to my own growing faith and how I believe that faith really saves. I don't think it's a matter of words. Talk, as they say, is cheap. So you can, it's so easy to just move your lips and say, I have accepted this or I have accepted that. It's another thing to demonstrate with your actions that you
And I
really,
think, that's really an important message. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that's something that you really try to convey to people when you're trying to do character development on one of your workshops. Am I right?
that's correct.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
As a matter of fact, I give assignments. I want people who I'm working with
Mm-hmm.
to demonstrate. Dennis, you just triggered an important thought with me. I give one example during every workshop that I would like to share with you.
Mm-hmm.
Because we, in psychology, we had this revolution a few years back that we call the cognitive behavioral revolution. Because we came to the big insight that the way we think about things and the attitudes we have and the beliefs we hold have a big bearing on our behavior. So if I'm a man who believes that a woman is a second-class citizen and who is my property if I marry her, and that she is supposed to be subservient to me, if I believe those things, I'm going to treat her in a certain way. So we know that attitudes and thinking patterns and core beliefs are related to behavior. But what clinicians universally forget is the opposite is true too. The way we act changes our minds and our hearts if we act properly, which is why the person I profess to follow in his command didn't tell us how to think. He ordered us how to act because he knew that it would change our hearts. So I give this example in my workshops. I talk about my grandson, Noah, who, when he was 4 years old, at the time we were living in a house that had a pool in our backyard. And for Christmas, we got his sister and him swimming lessons. And he had this way of thinking about the deep end of the pool and what would happen to him if he should follow the instructor's guidance and dive in. He just knew that if he did that, that he was not going to come out of it alive. That was his sincere belief. Now, clinicians make the same mistake that I did at first. When we get people in our office and we know that the way they're thinking about things is not healthy and it's leading to poor behavior, we try to reason with them and try to get them to change their way of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've ever tried to reason with a 4-year-old, but we tried that with my grandson Noah too. We tried to tell him that, that the instructor dives in there and he doesn't drown, and his sister could do that, and his uncle and his papu, that's me, we could do that. But he was having no part of it. What he had to learn over time, what he had to gain over time was experiential insight that comes with doing some things differently, like going in the shallow end, every now and then engaging in some horseplay, every now and then going under the water just a little bit and learning how to control breath, diving from the shallow end, jumping from the steps, learning all the coping strategies. And over time, doing little things step by step, gaining better breath control, learning how to better float in the water, learning your ability to manage your movements in the water, et cetera, et cetera. Over time, his attitude began to change. And then the day came when he was ready to try that dive. You didn't have to reason with him. All he had to do was to keep doing some things differently. The problem is, we try to do the same things over and over again and expect different results. That's the definition of insanity. We have to do some things differently. And as I pointed out in Judas syndrome, we had one command to follow by our spiritual leader, and most of us regard it as lofty advice, but completely impractical in this crazy mixed up world. So we don't do it. And because we don't do it, it hasn't changed our attitudes. It hasn't changed our hearts. It's sad for me. It's very sad, but I think that with some of the things happening right now, especially like with this COVID-19 pandemic and some of the efforts that we've had to make to deal with it, I think depending on how we process this ordeal, I'm hoping that we learn some things. For example, I had to cut my own hair the other day because we're restricted in going to the public hair, cutting places and salons and whatnot.
I have to tell you something, Dr. Simon. I did the same with myself. I also shaved my own hair. And I don't think we look bad. Yeah.
But what I'm saying is, in those kinds of things, you gain an appreciation for something
Exactly.
that you took for granted before,
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm hoping that we learn some lessons.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm crossing my fingers.
Yeah.
We're a stubborn lot. Sometimes we learn things the hard way and very slowly.
Mm-hmm. Just the other, a few weeks ago, I was talking to a clinical psychologist, and he mentioned something about post-traumatic growth, like when we experience something bad, something that really tests our abilities and skills, we learn to cope with it and we learn to adapt with it. And I think that's one thing that we can learn from this, whether it's a manipulative relationship that we're struggling with, or whether isolation and loneliness in light of the coronavirus. I think that there's something about human nature, there's an instinctual characteristic within us that we know that we have to adapt and we can recover from this. I just have one final question for you, Dr. Simon. You said you're doing workshop, because most of my listeners and most of the people who will be watching this video, they're from the UK and they're from Europe. So I was just wondering, in light of the coronavirus, would you be delivering online webinar?
Actually, most of my live seminars were live streamed and recorded.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a seminar that was exclusively done for live for distribution on the internet.
Mm-hmm.
It's available either in DVD or as a stream or as a download. So you can go to the PESI.com website and avail yourself of my workshops. All my in-person workshops for this year have been canceled. We had to cancel the whole year because things have to be booked so far in advance. And not knowing what the status of things is going to be, even in May or June, we had to cancel the whole year. It's possible, depending on how things shape up, it's possible at the very end of the year I might be doing a workshop or two, but this year we've had to cancel the live. But everything's available online, and there are links to all of that on my website as well.
Okay,
but you can go to PESI.com. They're my workshop coordinator.
Okay. What I'll do is I'll put all of those links on the description box, so some of the people who are interested to follow your work, to follow your workshop, they'll be able to access that. Dr. George Simon, it's really been an insightful conversation with you. It's the first time that I talked to a clinical psychologist whose expertise is within manipulative relationships. So I really learned a lot, but unfortunately our time is up. And I look forward to hearing more about your work, and thank you for sharing your expertise and your time.
Well, thank you, Dennis. It's been a pleasure to be with you. And anytime, what a wonderful conversation. Love to do it again sometime.
Thank you.